first part, we looked at kind of the story of building this thing, but here we're going to look more detailed at how I did it and really how I did it with very little resources. If it was in the first part, I was trying to do this on a budget of $10,000 and I failed. It came in at 12, but I'm still pretty proud of it. So one of the most important tools, I would say, is having the confidence to tackle something like this. And there was some encouragement I took from a story of Lotus mechanics. I think it was when they were running the Lotus 25 or 33, that car. And they were in Europe, I think they were in Italy. The car had been wrecked at a race. They had another race in a week or two, and so they had to build up an entire new tub, away from the facilities, away from their factory, out in a garage. So they marked out on concrete kind of the plans, and people talk about doing this with a tube steel construction, but on a monocoque, this is a little trickier. They were able to do it in the course of a week. They built up the entire car, and when they measured all the suspension points, the car was only off by 3/8 of an inch. Now you might be thinking, it was off by 3/8 of an inch. They did it in a week on the floor of a shop in another country. The fact that they did that just kind of told me, hey, if they can do that in a week, then I can do something like this in a year or two and hopefully be better than 3/8 of an inch off. The aluminum I used in it is 6061 T6. An original one would have been made out of L72, which is the kind of aluminum they used in the Spitfire. And that, in modern terms, is a 2000 series aluminum with copper in it. It's very, very strong. It is susceptible to corrosion, and that's why they put a pure aluminum cladding on it. But because when I built this, I was living near the beach, corrosion was going to be a huge thing. I was building the car outside. It was going to sit outside. In fact, the only reason the car doesn't live outside now is I moved. So I needed something that had a little better corrosion properties. I believe it's also cheaper, which that didn't hurt. Another one of my limitations was I didn't have a sheet metal brake that was super long. I had one from Harbor Freight that was 30-something inches. So I wasn't going to be able to do these long panels here and make them so that they had the kind of flap underneath that you would then rivet to the floor. So what I ended up doing is taking what I'd call them an angle iron if it was steel, but this is aluminum 6061, taking long strips of these and putting it, well, it's on the inside, so it would be behind this panel there, and this is riveted to this, and this is riveted to the floor. And that meant twice as many rivets, and it wouldn't be as strong. It's thicker than the sheet, but that was just what I had to do because I couldn't bend that and make it perfectly straight at the time. Actually, I got better at bending things by hand, and I'll show you some of that. The other thing, though, was these folds here, and I really wanted to copy this detail from the original. And I tried to do these over some wood and some thick steel tubes and using a lot of deep C-clamps and hammers and jumping and swearing and all kinds of stuff like that. And what I found was, I think what was going on was I was work hardening it. So as I was making these folds, and you get it part way and then you need to go a little more and go a little more. Each time I did a pass, it got stiffer and it got to the point that I just couldn't move it anymore and I wasn't finished. So what I ended up doing was taking it to a sheet metal fabrication place, and they put the folds in it for me. I think it was $80 a side, and that saved me. I mean, the brake to do something like that would have been $5,000. On a related note, I ended up having the same fabrication place do the roll hoop for me. I really wanted my own tube bender, and I was planning to get one. But the bender was, I think, $250 at the time, and then the die was another $250. So it was $500, and this was the only bend I needed. They did it for me for 40 bucks, which it's hard to argue with $40 versus $500. So all that to say, sometimes the best resource is to have somebody else do something for you because it's just much more economical. And they're probably going to do a better job if you've never done it before. For the inner panels, get this out of the way, things like this, this was originally going to be a bigger structure that came up, and this was going to fit inside. And there's another one down here that I was going to put the battery in, and it just got to the point where a battery wasn't going to fit, and at least not one big enough to do any good. I kind of wish I had made that work because that would have put some more weight on the front wheels. Besides adding stiffness to the structure here, this other one in here is important because it's supporting the load from the front suspension, from the rear pickups of the lower front suspension, so that the chassis isn't getting pinched in when you've got braking forces coming into it. This here is just for looks. It actually has a hinge, and it comes forward, and the fuel filler pipe is here because there's a fuel cell under this panel, and in an original, the fuel would have been in the sides. My sides are a little small, partly because I needed more cockpit space, but also by modern safety standards, fuel should always be in the central location so that if you're hit from the side, it's not a fuel leaking area. And also, I mean, just think of a driver is the least likely thing to catch fire, to set the fuel on fire with. So having the driver there is kind of a nice safety thing. I got a standard 5-gallon Formula Ford one, which does limit this thing's capacity. I'm thinking about having a custom one made that I think if I give it the full dimensions I have in here, or even move the seat to make it a little more reclined, I could easily get 6, maybe 6.5 or even 7 gallons in there. 5 gallons is enough for a 20-minute track session. 2 gallons is enough for 14 runs at an autocross. But I think if it had a couple more gallons, or at least one more gallon, you could do 30-minute sessions at a lot of tracks and not have to worry about it. The outer panels, I didn't put any shape into ahead of time. What I did was I drilled all the holes that I was going to use, and then I riveted in the bottom, and then I took ratcheting straps and just wrapped them around a bunch of places and tightened it until it met up with where it was going to rivet to, and then I kept working the rivets up and then all the way across. And then I stepped back and I let it sit for a few days as it warmed up and cooled down in the sun, and I looked for rivets to pop out because I didn't know if what I did was going to work or not. But it worked great, and the car has been great now for 7 years, 6 years, 7 years, something like that. So this is a Harbor Freight shrinker stretcher combo. This is the shrinker, the stretcher's over here. This is on the stand with the foot thing, which I eventually splurged for. Normally it just comes with a handle here, and you put it in a vise. When I first saw an ad for one of these, they showed how you could use the shrinker to shape a channel of metal, and they were showing it for replacing drip rails on a car. And I just thought, why would I spend all this money for a tool that makes drip rails? Like, when was the last time I replaced a drip rail on a car? That seems so stupid. And it seemed so dumb to me that it wouldn't leave my head. And I was at work, and I just kept thinking about, like, why would you buy this thing? And then it occurred to me that you could take it to make like an angle iron, but out of aluminum. You know, make a 1 inch by 1 inch, 90-degree angle long strip, and then shrink it or stretch it to curve it. And if you curved it, you would then make an attaching point for a curved outer surface. And that meant there were all kinds of things that I wanted to build that I could suddenly build. And that's how I made the inner kind of brackets. You know, wherever I have a curved bulkhead inside the Indy car and the skin's got to wrap around it, I made a channel, or like an angle, with this that curves, and it rivets to the curved bulkhead panel, and then the outer skin goes around it. And I'll show you. Something like this. And put it in. And just keep working it down. It's a lot of practice. And you see it's starting to get a curve, and I can go in and make the places that aren't curving enough curve a little more, and you can check it against whatever you're shaping it to while you're doing it. It's not the fastest process in the world, but that's a good thing because that makes it harder to screw up. The windshield's just polycarbonate. It's not shaped or anything. Just having it bolted in, this is the original one, that's a replacement. Just bolting it in puts the shape into it. And this is 3/16, so it's thick enough that at 100 miles an hour, it's not flopping around at all. I could probably do 1/8, but this works. For the rear, I'm quite obviously cheating. On a real one, on an original, the aluminum goes all the way back. It actually ends about here. I have to do something kind of funky because having a road car transmission means I have to support it a little further back. It's the first thing I've built like this, and the idea of putting a 400-pound engine in some sheet metal that you can flop around before it's formed just scared the crap out of me. I know better now, but this is fine. This is a triangulated steel tube structure. It's 1.5-inch diameter square tubes on the inner part, and then 1-inch ones on the outer part. The outer ones are more for looks to give it the shape that I needed than for structure. There's 65 thousandths inch thick tubing wall on the bottom, but on the top they're 1/8 inch thick, and that's because I'm sure I could have done 65 thousandths on both the top and bottom, but when you're doing a structure like this, the bottom is in tension and the steel is a lot stronger that way, and the top is in compression. And in compression, the tube can buckle, so it can be a good idea to use thicker steel or thicker metal on the upper tubes. Of course, that hurts your center of gravity a bit. So the roll hoop is part of a steel bulkhead structure here made out of tube steel. And there's another one back here, and this upper piece unbolts so you can get the gearbox in and out. And like I said, original, the top of the rear bulkhead would have been back here and held up the transmission right here. And that means the output shafts from the transmission are clear to go to the wheels. Here, it was helpful that I had tube steel there because I needed somewhere for the axles to go through. What I ended up doing on the GT40 to solve that problem is I did this bulkhead at an angle. And at some point, I'm thinking I might chop off the back of this and do that, because that would shorten the frame, make it lighter, and make it look more like an original. The other nice thing about the tube steel is I made my engine bay a little small. I made it before I had an engine, so it was all estimates. And what I found is, because mine's a little small, the starter wouldn't have fit in there if it was all just solid aluminum sheet. Because it's tube steel, there's gaps, there's spaces in there that things can fit, and the starter only fits because I did it that way. So next time, we'll do it different, we'll do it better. The shifter was originally going to be a rod all the way back to the transaxle, because the gearbox I was originally going to use, the Citroen one, had its selector on that side, on the same side of the car as this, and then I could just have some U-joints in there, and I could get the shifting mechanism all the way back like you would see in any car from the period, especially club racers and other Formula cars. But then they ended up switching to the Audi 016 gearbox, and its selector was on the opposite side. So that right there was kind of a huge problem. And what I decided to do was to make a cable shifting system, but I'd already done all this work. Back right behind this bulkhead is, on the end of that tube, is just a square piece of tube bolted to it that does this as you rotate, and has another, at the end of this tube is a pickup point for another push-pull cable for going back and forth. So one cable's doing this direction and the other cable's going up and down as the thing twists. It's basically a bell crank. That's a little funky, and it's not the greatest system. I still haven't, after years, I keep making improvements to it, and I still haven't worked all the bugs out. It doesn't have great feel, but it does work, usually. And at the back, this is clearly a little agricultural. It's just pieces of square tubing that I welded together to mount the push-pull cables to. And I've gone through several versions. I had one that looked nicer, and then I kept kind of changing things, and this was something I could mock up real quickly. I should probably now make something that looks a little less ridiculous now that I know exactly where the mounting point should be. But let's give it a try. Let's see. So that's second, first, third, fourth. This is the front subframe that I did in tube steel, which gives you good access. You can get into things pretty easily. This here is aluminum to just spread this load out a little bit more. This is the tightest packaging on the whole car, and I'm a little proud of it, but there's something I wish I had done better, which is when I made the car, There were two things. One, I underestimated how much room I would need for pedal travel. And so even making the car longer, I don't really have enough leg room. I just barely fit in there, where I wanted somebody bigger than me to be able to fit. And as it is, I barely fit. The other thing is, in order to give that leg room, I just made the whole car longer. And the net result of that is a longer wheelbase with less weight on the front wheels. So it's got poorer turn in just because it's longer. Yeah, it would be more stable at higher speeds. But that less weight, I'm really limited in front grip, and the way I make up for that is by limiting the rear grip until it's just terrible at both ends. So what I wish I had done, now I was trying to just be simple and not be clever, and again, it's the first thing I ever made. It was totally a prototype. I wanted simple solutions so that the whole thing wouldn't fail because I took on something more than I could chew. But looking back at it now, what I wish I had done is design this so that the pedal box fits into this area a little more, and that's the way period cars were. And that way I could have had this whole thing back a little bit, but still had the leg room. And if I did this again, maybe I'd split the difference, where if I had the pedals come in here, say 4 inches, I could give myself 2 inches more leg room and shorten the wheelbase 2 inches, or maybe 1 inch more leg room and 3 inches less wheelbase. So that's something I wish I'd done. The radiator, while we're here, I got this on eBay, and I'm pretty sure it came from China, but it was a place selling Formula car radiators, and they had one that was like a centimeter or 1.5 centimeters too tall, and I just contacted them and said, hey, can you make that same one, but just make it this little bit shorter? And they were like, sure. And so then I said, oh, well, while you're at it, can you make it so the inlet water attachment is at the bottom rather than the top like you normally see, just because I knew my pipes were going to be on the bottom, and that saved me. I don't know that I need to do that. I don't know if that causes any problems, but they did it and everything works. So there we go. Electric cooling fan is really nice, sitting on grid and autocross, that I can run both the water pump and the cooling fan and cool the thing down with the engine off. The rockers on the front suspension started off with these. They were used from an 80s Formula Ford. And I used, I think they're pronounced Nadella bearings in here for their needle bearings for the rotating motion. And I found these, they really want you to have a hardened surface inside, so a regular bolt's not going to do it. And I was always a little nervous in bolting them on, getting the right amount of preload, so it didn't have any slop, but I wasn't crushing the bearings, and it worked for years. The downside of these kind of rockers, well, besides being an undampened spring, is you can't really, there's not a lot of adjustment you can do to at least this portion of your suspension when you're using this. You know, you can't be adjusting the wheel in this way or this way. So what I ended up doing was making my own, and these aren't the prettiest. These are actually kind of just a prototype for right now, because I wanted to try this, and then I figured I might go a little more extreme. So what I ended up doing is, with these, the attaching point for the suspension is right in the middle. And so what I ended up doing is moving this back so it's a straight line here, and then more of an angle. So basically it's a right triangle here. And that moves my front axle back 2.5 inches. And I'm kind of thinking I might want to actually have this come back at an angle and get it to 3.5 inches, because moving it back made a huge difference in the amount of front grip I have. I put it on the scales and it added 70 pounds. Oh, the way it was originally, there was only 500 pounds on the entire front axle, so 250 aside, and quite a bit of that is brake and upright and wheel and tire. So there's just really a lack of weight here. So moving these back gets some of the weight off the rear axle and onto here. It's something that I might want to take a little further. Obviously, if I go back too far, it starts to look funky because of where the opening is here, and I've got my steering up here. If I could move my steering back here, I could be more extreme. But for right now, I'm happy with it. It's a point of continued development, we'll say that. It's a fun way of saying I'm guessing checking, trial and erroring. And then on these new ones, I've just got brass bushings in here, which is something, obviously the kind of bearings that are in here, I've never seen on a period car. I don't know that they existed back then. You can get bushings in a lot of different sizes from McMaster Car, and you can get ultra high density plastic ones. You can get these are brass. You can get all kinds of different materials. And then if you can't get exactly the size you need, you can drill them out to what you need. So this actually has a much tighter fit than I had with these. I've got less slop that I have to take up. So I'm really happy with that so far. Originally for the rear suspension, I wanted to use GT40 replica rear uprights, but because I ended up jumping ship and getting on the Mustang 2 bandwagon in the front, I wanted to see if I could find something easier to source in the US for the rear, and I came up with, these are late 90s T-Bird, Ford Thunderbird knuckles, and they're also used on the SVT Cobra from that era, from like 2000. The downside to them, among other things, is the GT40 one would have been much closer to the correct style, where this attaching point is correct, but down here it would have come down here, and that would have meant your lower control arm would come in nice and low, where it's well supported on the rear bulkhead to the other side of the car. What happened was when I put these on, and I bought them kind of out of desperation, and originally this upper control arm was going to share the bolt, because that's something Lotus does on a lot of their cars, although I don't think they do on the 38. But they shared this bolt, so it would have attached up here. And when I did that, you know, I had modeled everything for the original design, and then I just threw these on, threw caution to the wind, because they were so much cheaper, and realized, oh, this is terrible geometry. So I ended up putting a new hole in here and having it connect here, trying to get about the right roll center height that the original had, because I wanted it to be faithful to what they thought was a good idea for handling at the time. And it looks particularly funky right now because I've put bigger tires on, and in order to get my ride height anywhere close to not looking ridiculous, I've got them coming down quite a bit. I'm going to be moving on to some shorter but stickier slicks here in the near future. Something that wasn't as cheap as I would have liked it to be is, in order to get the engine mounts all correct in here, when I was making the engine bay, I bought a foam mock-up block, and this is it right here. What's nice about this is, obviously, it's a heck of a lot lighter, and it's got all the proper holes. It's got threaded inserts so you can bolt things into it. And so, taking the motor mount holes, I could bolt motor mounts in to that, or brackets if you're just going to do brackets, and then put that in the engine bay and get it all level and lined up, and then weld what I needed to weld, so that then you could just unbolt this, it would come right out. And I've used this now 3 times, I mean on 3 different cars, and I've never had engines go in so easily. I've worked on regular production cars and not had the holes line up so well as what I've done with this. So I highly recommend it. The downside is these things aren't cheap. I think this was $300 when I got it. I think they're $500 now. If you can get them on eBay, that's better. My plan originally was, I figured, okay, I'll buy it, and then when I'm done, I'll sell it and try to get half my money back. But I'm glad I didn't, because I've used it again and again. I have seen some other versions of this that are much less expensive. I haven't tried them. I don't know. I don't think they have all the holes, but if they've got the important ones, that could be another alternative. So this was the second nose I made. The first being the aluminum atrocity. And this was done in fiberglass, and it looked fine. I mean, it looked so much better than the aluminum one that I was super happy with that. And I'd never done a fiberglass thing from scratch. I'd done some surfboard repair, but that's about it. So I actually made this nose out of carbon fiber, and the way I did this, a little more complicated than that one. I formed a sheet steel plug. I had some wood kind of bucks, and I put sheet steel over it, and I actually shaped it with the English wheel, so it's got a little bit of a compound curve. And I then took that, and then I made a fiberglass mold out of that. That, amongst all the model cars up there, is the nose plug. nose plug. It's the plug I made for making the carbon fiber nose. And it's a little rough. I should touch it up before I make another one. And then over here, this is the fiberglass mold I made off of that. And it could use a little work too. And then I did the vacuum bagging, or at least I attempted. It didn't work out all that well. Using that mold, I made a top and a bottom half of this nose cone in carbon fiber using epoxy rather than polyurethane like I used on the fiberglass. And then I epoxied those together and did some more carbon fiber strips to help support everything. And so when I made this one, there's a ton of filler on top, and I could probably keep sanding this and make it ultra smooth, and I would never get down to the fiberglass. This, because I made it in the mold, it's got very little filler on top, just to kind of smooth it. It's more the high build epoxy sealer that's on it that hides the weave. This is about half the weight of this, not because carbon fiber is that much stronger, but because it was so thick and had so much filler on it. But you could still make something lighter than this. I do tend to hit cone, so I want it to be a little sturdy. But this is about 9 or 10 pounds, and this is about 20 pounds. So I hope that gives you some ideas on how to do things for your own projects. Answer a few questions and hopefully give you some inspiration to go do something better than what I did. With that, I'll let you get back to it. Thanks for watching.